Hello, and welcome to Conquering Finale. My name is Jason Lafredo, and today we are continuing on with the Missing Linked Parts series of videos. We're talking about voiced linked parts today, or shared staffs. In other words, you can have multiple instruments on the same staff, flute 1 and 2 here, and have separate linked parts that have just the flute 1 part and just the flute 2 part. And I have this score set up in a way that to demonstrate all of this. I have all of these woodwinds and brass instruments, and you can even do as much as 4 or more instruments on a single staff. It does get a little bit complicated, and there are some limitations to this, so hopefully I can explain this in a way that will make sense to you, because it does get pretty involved and it does get pretty confusing pretty quickly. The first thing to realize is that in the Manage Parts window, it is entirely possible to have multiple linked parts using the same staff or group. Now, I have it set up for most of these instruments except flute 1, 2, which I'll do for you, but flute 3 here, you'll notice is using flute 3, 4 staff. The flute 4 is also using the flute 3 and 4 staff. So both of these parts are using the same staff from the score, right? So that's what we need to do initially with this flute 1, 2. So the first thing I'm going to do is edit the part name here so that it's just saying flute 1. All right, and now it's using the flute 1, 2 staff, and then I'm going to add a new part and call this flute 2. Just like that, and we're going to also use the flute 1, 2 staff. So again, both linked parts, flute 1 and flute 2, are using the same staff, right? And actually, if we take a look at those parts, we'll see that the flute 1 part is using the flute 1, 2 staff, and so is the flute 2 part. It's using the same staff, right? The next trick to this is using the specify voicing or the edit voicing button, and it doesn't matter if you check here or if you click here, you get to the same window. You get to this voicing windows, and what this is going to do is it's going to define for this linked part that you have selected which notes it's going to choose from that flute 1, 2 staff. All right. Now it chooses the note in a very semantic and very if-then logic type of way. So you really do have to pay very close attention to the way that everything in here is worded so that you can get this right. Now the only parameters that this if-then logic will use are layers and chord voicing. So you see in the oboe 3, 4 part here, I have 2 notes on these chords. You can say, I want the top note, the bottom note, the middle note, the third note, the fourth note, whatever it is. That's the type of logic that it will use. It would only use that and layers, which means that you can do all of this stuff with the 1 and 2 and the A2 and everything. You can do this as much as you want with expressions. It's not going to be interpreted by that voiced part system. It just doesn't work like that. You have to use the logic that's based on either layers or the number of notes in the particular chord that you're dealing with. So let's start talking about this logic because it is very semantic and very specific. First thing is to realize that what the first thing says is this staff in this part will display, and then whatever it is you select here, right? This staff, flute 1 and 2, in this part, flute 1 will display the following, and then we're going to set that up, right? So that's what's going on. And there's basically 2 main options here. There's this first option which says all notes in layer 1, 2, 3, or 4 only, and you get to select. And there's a second option here which is going to let you parse this out even further. But let's just talk about this first option and just deal with this first. So all notes in layer 1 only. Period. That's all this is doing. It will tell you that this part is going to show every single note that exists in layer 1 and nothing else. That's what the if-then logic says here, right? And we can do the same thing for flute 2. Let's go in here and say all notes in layer 2 only, right? Nothing else. That's all you're saying, right? Which means that now when I go to the flute 1 part, it's going to show me all of the notes that exist in layers 1, and that's it. Even here, there's chords here, but it's still showing me all the notes because that's the logic. It says all notes in layer 1. The flute 2 part said all notes in layer 2, which includes these chords, right? Which is not necessarily the way that you'd want to do this. And if you notice in my score, I even have notes written in layer 3, and they do not appear in either flute 1 or the flute 2 part, right? Again, it's totally semantic. It's just saying, just take layer 1 notes and put it in this part, period. Now, this is usable to a degree if you follow that in the score. So if I were to continue to write the part with this notation so that, the chord lines are separated by layers, then it will continue to work. As soon as you put the chord lines in a single layer, this is where it doesn't work. And obviously, if you go into a different layer, it's not going to work. So you can work like this so long as that everything in flute 1 is in layer 1, everything in flute 2 is in layer 2. Again, very semantic, very precise. Now there's a little bit of a better way to do this, and I'm going to take flute 3 and 4 as an example, and you can see that my flute 3 and 4 part so far is exactly like the flute 1 and 2 part, so I can just show you the difference. Let's go back here, and let's start dealing with the flute 3 part, and we'll specify the voicing here. And instead of using this overall option of just using layer 1, we're going to choose selected notes from one or more layers, okay? Again, read that semantically. The selected notes from one or more layers, right? And there's a footnote here. Notes in a part with a specified voicing must be edited while viewing the score. This actually applies to both options here. This literally means that when you have this option selected for specified voicings, you cannot edit the notes from the linked part anymore. You have to edit them from the score. All right, so we choose selected notes, and then we get these rules for selecting those notes from one or more layers, right? And there's a bunch of different things going on here, and let's read the first one. In measures containing a single layer display. Again, read that literally. Measures containing a single layer, any single layer. That's what that means, right? In measures containing any single layer display all the notes, top note, bottom note, or selected notes, and we'll get into this in a second, but let's for now just do top note. So any single layered measure, it's going to choose the top note. And then you also get this option here, in measures containing multiple layers, display layer whatever you want. So we're going to say layer 1, okay? And this is how we're going to set up flute 3. And for flute 4, we're going to do sort of the opposite, selected notes. We're going to do bottom note. In measures containing multiple layers, display layer 2, okay? Now this will parse out these notes slightly differently than the flute 1 and 2, right? So let's take a look at what happened in flute 3 and 4 now. So now you can see in flute 3, what it did compared to flute 1 is that in this measure where we used to have those chords, let's go back to flute 1, now it's showing all the notes in that layer because that's the logic that you were using. Now you're saying just show me the top notes if there's only one layer in that measure, which in this measure 6, that's the case, right? In flute 4, it's saying the bottom note, right? So now we go back to the score, and you can see that the E starts that flute 4 part, and that's the only note that you see here. The other thing that you'll notice that's a major difference between flute 1 and 2 versus flute 3 and 4 is that in flute 3 and 4, you're seeing both parts. You're seeing the layer 2 and the layer 1 parts. Why is that? Well, again, follow the logic. What that option says, and I'll just pull it up one more time, is it says, for layer flute 3 here, in measures containing a single layer, display top note. Doesn't say layer 1, or layer 4, whatever, it says any single layer, right? So in this measure, there is only one single layer. There's only one single layer, and it's displaying the top note, which is basically the only note that's there. In flute 4, it's displaying the bottom note, which is also the only note that's there. So that's why you're seeing all of these notes in flutes 3 and 4 when you have this type of thing selected. Now, there's a couple ways to get around this, or rather, I should say a couple ways to manipulate the logic to your favor, I guess. The first way is in instances like this, when this is actually supposed to be a solo like this, is to actually go into layer 2 and just enter a whole rest, and in this bar, enter a whole rest here. And now there is data in both layers 1 and 2 in this measure, and in both layers 1 and 2 in this measure. So in these cases, there are multiple layers in this measure, which means that based on that logic that you set up for flute 3 and 4, it's going to put a rest here in flute 3, and it's going to put a rest over here in flute 4 because these are actual rests. There's actual data in the layer 2 here, right? The reason why you'd want it to be set up like this is that this will allow you to do unison. So I don't necessarily have to have this set up like this with the double stems. In fact, I could just eliminate layer 2 here, and we'll call this a unison. I could put the unison marking here if I really wanted to, but because it's just a single layer, it's going to show up correctly in all the parts, or rather part 3 and part 4, right? I didn't need to do that double stem. So that's what's going on here. If there's a single layer, it will show the top note or the bottom note. That's the logic of it. Now, aside from using the rests like this, there is another way to do this. So let me just go back in here, and I'm just going to delete these whole rests here. We can actually use staff styles sometimes to our advantage. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into the flute 3 part, and I don't want to see this measure here, right? I just want to see this measure and then a blank measure and then see the notes again, right? So what I can do here is actually create a staff style, and I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to call this hide layer 2. And we're going to use an alternate notation, and what we want to do is choose a blank notation with rests, and we want to apply this to layer 2. Now this will turn any measure that you have here into a blank notation with rests, and you want to make sure that all the other notes and everything are showing here. That's all good, and press OK. And now we've just defined a new staff style. Now what we can do is apply it just to the part. So go to Apply Staff Style to Current Part or Score, meaning whatever it is you're viewing, and now you can choose Hide Layer 2, and you'll see that that will go away in the flute 3 part, but in the score it does not go away because we had applied that staff style simply to the part, if that makes sense. So that's one way to sort of get around this particular issue if you want to do it like that. Another way is actually, let's go back in here and put a whole rest in there as well. We could actually do it backwards too, so we could set it up like this so that the logic works out of the box in this situation, and then actually use this staff style just in the score, current part or score, hide layer 2, and you get the same results, that you're only seeing the one layer here, and of course it will not show up in flute 4 because that rest still exists, even though it's hidden technically just in the score, if that makes sense. So when you start getting into these voice parts, sometimes having these types of staff styles is actually really handy, these hide layer 2, hide layer 1 staff styles, and that's pretty much exactly how you have to set it up. In fact, you could probably create 4 of them, hide layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, and just set them so that each one is applying to that particular layer, and make sure everything else is showing. And this will allow you to sort of solve some of the weird problems that you're going to have, because again, this logic is very semantic, and we don't always think that semantically when we're writing. Like I said, you'll probably just want to put 1, 2, 2 here for situations like this. So so that's what's going on. I'm just going to look at the oboe 1, 2 part here for a second, and I'm going to do something slightly different. I'm going to go into the Manage Parts here and look at oboe 1, and we're going to try the Specify Voicings. We're going to try the selected note from 1 or more layers, and we're going to talk about this all notes situation. Now, it seems like it would be very similar to all notes in layer 1, except what this is saying now is that it's all notes if the measure contains a single layer, right? So very, very subtle difference. Now it will show all notes whether those notes are in layer 1 or layer 2 if there's only a single layer in that measure. If there are multiple measures, it's still going to only show layer 1 or layer 2, depending on how you have this set up. So let's just do this. Oboe 1, all notes in a single layer showing layer 1. Oboe 2, all notes in a single layer in multiple layers showing layer 2. So it's ever so subtly different because now when we go to the oboe 1-2 part, we should see, we're seeing all the notes in layer 1 because they exist. We're also seeing all the notes in layer 2, which is just a single line here. And then the same thing with oboe 2. The difference is that just this third measure, I have different notes between layers 1 and 2. And so that's what's getting parsed out. It's another way to do it. Again, you just have to think about the logic and if this makes sense for the particular way that you have this staff set up. All right, so that's the all notes option here. So let's look at oboe 3 and 4, which is just a copy of oboe 1 and 2 in my score. And we're going to start talking about the other option here called selected notes. Now, when you have this option checked, you get the option of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you can actually select multiples. So you can have the first and third note if you really want to. You can get very, very specific here. But you also have to look at how this is being counted. And there's two options, count from the top or count from the bottom, right? So in this case, I'm saying I want to take the selected notes, the first note from the top, all right? In measures containing multiple layers, display layer 1, and we'll click OK. And for the oboe, let's just say we're going to do selected notes. We're going to do selected notes second from the top, all right? Now, once again, you really have to think about this literally because there is a big difference between second note from the top and first note from the bottom. Even if you only ever have two notes, it's different. And the reason for that is that if you think about it, if I count this first measure here, the first note from the top is G, A flat, G, B flat, right? First note from the top, E flat, F, G, A flat, because it's just one thing. The second note from the top in this first measure is the bottom note here, E flat, F, E flat, G. The second note from the top in this second measure doesn't exist because there is no second note from the top. However, there is a first note from the bottom, which is this line because this is literally the first note from the bottom, right? Which is different than bottom note versus top note. The second note from the top is not the same as the first note from the bottom. Now, when you choose this selected notes option, you also have this option to include single note passages. So in this case, it wouldn't matter whether or not you choose second note from top or if you choose first note from the bottom. The second measure is going to be put in this this oboe 4 part in this case, regardless, because it's including single note passages. All right. Again, it gets so literal with this stuff, but you really have to pay attention to exactly how the if-then logic is working here. All right, so we have oboes 3 and 4 set up, second note from top for oboe 4, and we'll call this layer 2, and then go back here, just make sure this is set up correctly. We'll go first note from top, make sure we're including single note passages anyway, include layer 1 when there's multiple layers, and click OK, and let's see if I did this right. My oboe 3 and 4 line should be parsed out correctly, and let's go to oboe 3. We see the top line, the solo line here, and then the layer 1 line, and then the layer 2 line, again, because this measure in the score is by itself. So it's selecting the single note from that single layer to display in oboe 3, and in oboe 4, we'll get the same thing. We'll get the bottom notes where it's appropriate, and we'll get the single notes in either layer 1 or 2 where appropriate, right? So once again, you can see how this can get confusing very quickly when you start dealing with this, but you really just have to think about this, this edit voicing things in a very logical if-then way. Now, where you can run into problems with this, you can certainly parse out more than one instrument on a staff too. As you can see, I have this clarinet, these 3 clarinets here. Where you have to be careful is when you have situations like this where you have a chord of 2 notes in one layer and then a single note passage in another layer, because this edit voicing can't get that detailed. It can't say if there's multiple voices and if that multiple voice has multiple or if there's multiple layers, and if that multiple layer has multiple voices, then take this line. The logic that would be required for that would just be so extensive. It would be, as confusing as it is already, it would just be impossible to understand. So there are some limitations to this. And if we look at this part, and let's just set up our clarinets a little bit to see what we can do here. Clarinet 1, we can say we're going to take selected notes. We'll say top note, layer 1, clarinet 2, we'll say, let's take selected notes second from top, layer 2. And for clarinet 3, we'll say, let's take the bottom note and layer 3, right? Now this is not going to work perfectly because, as I mentioned, it doesn't know what to do with this first measure. In fact, let's go over to, if I can find it, clarinet 1. It parsed this out correctly, right? Because this is a single line in layer 1. And then, of course, layer 2 appears, and it can't really divide this chord up, and it does something weird in here because now it's saying, well, if there's multiple layers, choose layer 3. Well, there are multiple layers in this measure. It's just that there is nothing in layer 3, so you get nothing in these measures. So, again, you really have to be careful. When you start getting things like this, you have to get really, really specific about how you do this. In fact, in this line down here, maybe you can see that a little better if I zoom in. I do actually have this parsed out in multiple layers. So there's a layer 3 part here, a layer 2 part, and the unisons here on the bottom actually are using both layers 2 and 3. So actually, if I just, I should be able to just copy those into here. And now those parts should be parsed out correctly for clarinets 1, 2, and 3. Let's check it out. There's clarinet 1. There's clarinet 2, and there's clarinet 3. So yeah, when you get into more than 2 parts, it gets really, really tricky, and you have to be really, really careful about something. The other thing I wanted to point out, because this is kind of a neat trick, so I've got this same line for clarinets 1, 2, and 3 here. In this line here for clarinet and E flat plus clarinet B flat 4 and 5, I'm just going to show you a real trick. Nifty trick here. Just give me a second. I'm going to set these up with the same types of voicings. So top note layer 1. Let's go to second note from top, layer 2. And for clarinet 5, we'll go to bottom note layer 3, just like with clarinets 1, 2, and 3. And we should get the same thing. Now you notice I have 2 different transpositions on this staff. Now this is a concert score, so I'm just showing it in E flat for everything. And if I go ahead and go to, let's see, the B flat 4 clarinet part, right? We're in the right key, 1 flat. We go over to the E flat clarinet. This is the wrong key. This is in the B flat key. This is a really nifty trick that you can do with the score manager. If you're viewing the part and you unlink the instrument in this part, you can actually change the instrument, which will change the transposition. So I can choose the clarinet in E flat right here, and we'll now see this in the correct key for the clarinet in E flat. So I've got the clarinet in E flat here, clarinet in B flat in a different key, and then the other clarinet in B flat in that key. Despite the fact that they're all sharing the same staff, I happen to be showing it in concert key here. If I were to show this in transposed key, it would show this in the B flat key just because of the way I initially set this up. But if you're doing something like this, you're probably going to be showing in concert key anyway. But anyway, just to show you that you can actually have different transpositions on the same staff if you do it like that. I also have something similar set up for the bassoon and contrabassoon. You can do the same thing. You can go to your contrabassoon. I didn't do the voicing here yet, but you get the idea. You can go in here, choose the unlink, and then instead of bassoon, you can choose the contrabassoon, and you'll get a different transposition. You'll just notice that all of those notes go up, and if I were to parse this out correctly, you'd see the right notes on the right staff. You can see the bassoon line. Both of these linked parts are using the same staff, but you can see the transposition is different at the octave. So that's a really, really nifty little additional trick to this. Now, the video is starting to get a little long in the tooth, so I'm just going to kind of gloss over some of this stuff because I think you hopefully will get part of the idea. But just to be aware that when you start getting into complicated things like this, where you're showing 4 different parts on a single staff, it can get really complicated. Now, if you have something that's just, in this case, horns 5 through 8, and they're just playing block chords like this through the entire piece, it's certainly entirely possible to set those voiced parts up so that, horn 5 is the top, horn 6 is the second from top, horn 8 is the bottom, horn 7 is the second from bottom, and as long as you're just doing 4-note chords for the whole piece, it will be fine. It will parse out perfectly. Where it gets complicated is when the divisions start to split, and things like this where you have 5 and 6 on the top, 7 and then 8, and then the division splits. So you have 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, and then all together. I mean, this is just impossible to do because how do you define this? So horn 6 is the second from top, but in this measure, horn 6 is the top note, is the first from top, right? You could do maybe horn 6 as the third from bottom, and that would work for both this one and this one because the third from bottom note is that second from top note, but it's also the right note here. But then when it shifts again, the third from bottom doesn't exist because there's only 2 notes here, so the horn 6 part would go away. So it really does get complicated when you start to shift the divisions like this. And there really is no way to deal with this because we can't change those voicings on a measure by measure basis. They basically apply to the whole staff, the whole part all at once. We can get around this by trying to do some funky stuff with layers. In fact, we could, instead of using all in layer 1, we could just do, horn 5 in layer 1, 6 and 2, 7 and 3, 8 and 4, and just write out the whole part like that. But as you can imagine, that gets very cluttered on your score, so it's not ideal. And also the issue is that when you have multiple layers, you do have to make sure that your markings are attached to all of those layers. So you'll end up with 4 slurs and 4 accents. It just gets really muddy really quickly. So the moral of the story is if it's simple and it's like this the whole way through, then it's possible to use those voicings. Then you get things like this trumpets, you're sharing 1, 2, and 3. Now, this is like probably the edge of what you'd want to put on a single staff anyway. In fact, more likely I would probably, do this with trumpet 1 on one staff and trumpet 2 and 3 on a separate staff just to make it more readable for the conductor. But certainly trying to parse this out with the linked parts, with the voicings, is just impossible. You can see how the things are shifting around. There's just no way to do this. So the next sort of trick to this is that we don't always have to use the voiced parts if we don't have to. And I'm going to show you how to do this a little bit in the next video, but just to kind of help you know how to set it up, what we're going to do is I'm going to add 3 new trumpet parts here. Trumpet 1, second trumpet, and 1 more trumpet, right? And if this one has the auto number style off, you'll get the correct numbering here, 1, 2, and 3. And basically what I'm going to do is hide these staffs in the score. Force hide, force hide, force hide. All right, and then we know that we can always edit those in scroll view. So now we go in here, zoom out a little bit, and you have your shared staff here. But what I can do is just copy it here and then manually, this is where it gets a little fussy, is that we can manually edit each of these staffs so that it only has the notes that we know that we want to have in there. So in this case for trumpet 1, I would just get rid of layers 2 and 3 altogether, and then I would get rid of the bottom notes in this third measure, and then I'd go through measure by measure and sort of parse this out. Now there's a trick I'm going to show you in the next video. It's actually a plugin that helps with this immensely. So the next video is going to be dedicated to sort of this process and that plugin. It will actually be a spotlight on plugins video. So we'll get into that next. But like I said, these voiced parts, they're really complicated. They can get very complicated very quickly. They're really useful if you're doing very simple things and if you can follow the if-then logic in that little window, because it is very specific. It's very semantic. So, but if the part is simple enough, it's certainly doable. One other thing I do want to mention, occasionally when you start doing stuff like this, I'm trying to find a good example. I don't really have it, but I'll just sort of set it up. Occasionally you may find yourself with extra like real rests when you're doing stuff like this. I think I showed you how you can kind of put a real rest here and a real rest here. Sometimes you'll get a bunch of them in a row, and sometimes that doesn't work out so well for you in the linked parts because, as you probably know, real whole rests can't be combined into multi-measure rests. But I'm just going to do it here just to kind of show you something. What's really handy, though, is that you can use the blank notation with rests in layer 1, and apply it to here. And this staff style will actually allow you to combine multi-measure rests, which is really cool. So even though there's data underneath these measures, if you use that blank notation with rest, alternate notation, it's this one, the blank notation with rest. This one doesn't work. It has to be this one. Then you're able to combine these things into multi-measure rests. You may run into this when you're dealing with these voiced parts, because sometimes you'll end up with several measures in a row where you had to enter a rest in order to get the right layer into the right part and all that stuff. So that's just a little FYI that you can use that trick of that staff style to allow yourself to combine those multi-measure rests. And also you may end up with situations where you may have, well, don't have any yet, but you may have expressions that don't need to appear, like obviously you don't need to see 4 here in the flute 4. So you can always just shift double click and make sure that this is showing in score only, and you'll see it disappear in the score, in the part rather, but it will always appear in the score. So that's just another trick about how to deal with some of these shared staff situations that might come up. All right, so that was a lot. This voiced part situation in Finale is very complicated. It is possible to share staffs like this. Like I said, you almost need an engineering degree in math to kind of figure out the if-then logic. But you know, if you can follow it, you can make it work. Otherwise, the sort of backfall position is to do what I just showed you with the trumpets and just create new dummy staffs that get hidden, and then you can edit these as much as you need to, and then use these hidden staffs for the linked parts. This is sort of a not necessarily a quicker way, but it's a safer way in some ways, because you don't have to follow all that logic and it can be a little bit easier to understand. The downfall is obviously that now these notes in these parts are no longer linked to the original staff. So if you end up making changes in your original trumpet shared staff, they're not going to get made in the linked parts, because those linked parts are actually attached to these dummy staffs, which are separated. So we have a couple different options of dealing with this, and this is a little bit complicated, but that's kind of how it goes with these things. All right, so that was a long one. Sorry about that, but hopefully this has been informative. I couldn't really figure out how to divide this into multiple lessons, so it is what it is. I hope you appreciate this, and so that's all for now. Come back, I'll talk about a little bit more about doing these dummy staffs and some tricks for parsing out these parts on those dummy staffs, because there's a really cool plugin that will help with that. It's called TG Tools Process Extracted Parts, and we're going to look at that next. All right, so once again, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already, and I will see you soon on the next video.